The medical bay aboard the Coalition research vessel hummed with quiet efficiency, its sterile walls reflecting the pale blue glow of monitoring equipment. Kree shifted uncomfortably on the examination table, his three-fingered hands trembling. As he clutched the datapad containing his testimony, the biolights along his scaled neck flickered erratically, a clear sign of stress among his people. "Begin when ready," Dr. Vex prompted gently, her compound eyes reflecting genuine concern for her patient's well-being. Kree's throat sac pulsed as he gathered his thoughts. "I was part of the 5th Expeditionary Force, tasked with the occupation of the 3rd planet in the Sol system. Command classified it as a routine pacification mission. The inhabitants were described as primitive, barely capable of interstellar travel, wielding crude chemical propulsion and basic energy weapons." He paused, his breathing becoming shallow. "We were so wrong, Doctor, so terribly, catastrophically wrong. The initial assault had seemed textbook perfect. 700 Coalition warships had emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming like silver daggers against the star-dotted void. The human fleet that rose to meet them numbered barely 100 vessels, a pitiful force that should have been swept aside in minutes. They came at us like madmen," Kree continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "No formation, no tactical doctrine we recognized. Their ships were crude, ugly things, metal boxes bristling with weapons that had no business being effective against our shields, but they were." The first indication that something was different came when the human vessels began ramming Coalition ships, not desperate last-stand ramming but calculated, surgical strikes where smaller human craft would sacrifice themselves to cripple much larger Coalition vessels. The pilots had ejected at the last possible moment, their escape pods broadcasting what the humans called war songs, haunting melodies that somehow made the Coalition crews uneasy. "They sang while they died," Kree said, his scales shifting to a darker hue. "Even as their ships exploded around them, even as our weapons cut them down, they sang. We had studied hundreds of species, conquered dozens of worlds, but we had never encountered anything like this. The planetary assault itself had been chaos. Coalition ground forces, equipped with energy weapons and powered armor, had expected to face primitive defenders with simple projectile weapons. Instead, they found themselves battling an enemy that seemed to materialize from the very ground itself. Every great journey starts with a few brave explorers. Sci-Fi stellar conflict is just beginning, and your support means everything. If you're hungry for HFY battles and tales of human valor against alien might, hit subscribe. It's free, and it helps us bring these front lines to you. Human soldiers emerged from hidden bunkers, from sewers, from the ruins of their own cities. They fought with a combination of advanced tactics and primitive brutality that left Coalition forces reeling. A human child, no more than half-grown, had destroyed an entire Coalition hover tank using nothing but scavenged explosives and what they called guts. The worst part, Kree admitted, his voice cracking, was that they enjoyed it. Not the killing, though some clearly did, but the challenge. They treated our invasion like some sort of game, constantly adapting, constantly finding new ways to hurt us. Every time we thought we had them figured out, they would do something completely unexpected. The Coalition's superior technology meant nothing when humans began using their own destroyed vehicles as improvised weapons. They would take Coalition plasma rifles, strip them down, and rebuild them into something more effective. They turned their own rubble into deadly maze-like fortifications that channeled Coalition forces into predetermined kill zones. By the end of the first day, Kree said, we had lost more troops than in our previous 10 campaigns combined. And the humans were just getting started. Dr. Vex adjusted her position in the chair, her multiple eyes focusing intently on Kree as he continued his testimony. The scaled alien's condition had stabilized somewhat, but she could see the deep psychological trauma etched in every line of his body language. The second day of the invasion, Kree resumed, was when we truly began to understand what we were facing. Command had expected resistance to crumble after our initial show of force. Instead, it intensified. The Coalition had deployed their standard urban pacification protocols, expecting to face scattered resistance cells hiding in the ruins of human cities. What they found instead was an entire population that had transformed itself into a fighting force. Elderly humans wielded improvised weapons with deadly precision. Children as young as 10 cycles ran messages between resistance cells, moving through destroyed buildings with an agility that confounded coalition sensors. They used everything, Kree said, his voice growing stronger as the memory consumed him. Kitchen knives became close combat weapons. Cleaning chemicals became improvised explosives. Even their cooking utensils were transformed into tools of war. We had energy shields that could stop plasma bolts, but they were useless against a human wielding a sharpened metal rod. The most disturbing aspect was how quickly humans adapted to coalition technology. Within hours of the first engagement, human engineers were studying captured coalition weapons, reverse engineering them with shocking speed. They couldn't replicate the advanced components, but they didn't need to. Instead, they would strip out the essential elements and rebuild them using their own materials. I watched a human take apart a coalition pulse rifle, Kree continued, his scales shifting to a mottled gray. She had no formal training, no understanding of quantum mechanics or energy field manipulation. But within 2 hours, she had created a weapon that fired projectiles with twice the stopping power of our standard issue equipment. The psychological impact on coalition forces was immediate and devastating. Soldiers who had conquered worlds without breaking formation found themselves jumping at shadows, terrified that any piece of debris might explode, that any human civilian might be carrying a weapon. The humans seemed to thrive on this fear. They would leave coalition equipment in obvious locations, but booby-trapped with explosives. They would broadcast human music over coalition communication frequencies, not as jamming, but as psychological warfare. The melodies were haunting, alien, and somehow managed to convey both beauty and menace simultaneously. Their music was the worst part, Kree admitted. It got into your head, made you think about things you didn't want to think about. Home, family, the possibility that maybe we were the ones in the wrong. But it was the humans' approach to casualties that truly unnerved the coalition forces. Every species the coalition had encountered treated death as something to be avoided, minimized, mourned. Humans seemed to view it as simply another tool in their arsenal. They would charge directly into our heaviest fire, Kree said, his voice barely audible. Not out of desperation, but as a calculated tactic. They knew that for every 10 who died, 1 might get close enough to do real damage. And they considered that acceptable. The coalition's advanced medical technology could heal most wounds, but the humans had learned to inflict injuries that were designed to be permanent. They used weapons that caused maximum psychological impact on coalition medics, knowing that treating horrific wounds would demoralize their forces. By the 3rd day, Kree continued, our casualty rates had exceeded anything in coalition military history. But the humans weren't just killing us. They were learning from us. Every tactic we employed, they found a counter. Every weakness we exploited, they turned into a strength. The coalition's orbital bombardment capabilities, their most decisive advantage, became useless as humans learned to use the rubble and craters as defensive positions. They turned their own destroyed cities into fortresses, using the very destruction meant to demoralize them as tactical advantages. They made us afraid, Kree said simply. An entire galactic coalition, reduced to fear by a single species that had never left their own solar system. The medical bay's lighting had shifted to a warmer hue as Dr. Vex noticed Kree's increasing agitation. She made a subtle adjustment to his medication levels, hoping to ease his distress without compromising the clarity of his testimony. The humans' capacity for adaptation wasn't just tactical, Kree continued, his voice taking on an almost reverent tone. It was psychological, technological, and somehow spiritual. They possessed something we had never encountered in any species across the galaxy. Coalition intelligence had predicted that human morale would collapse within 72 hours of sustained bombardment. Every previous species had followed predictable patterns: initial resistance, gradual demoralization, surrender, integration. Into the coalition, humans shattered every psychological model the coalition possessed. They got stronger, Kree said, his scales flickering with confusion even now. As conditions worsened, as casualties mounted, as their cities burned around them. They became more determined. It defied every principle of military psychology we understood. The Coalition's information warfare specialists had deployed their most sophisticated propaganda systems, designed to break enemy morale through targeted psychological manipulation. They broadcast messages about the futility of resistance, benefits of Coalition membership, the superior technology and lifestyle that awaited those who surrendered. Humans responded by broadcasting their own messages, not propaganda, but something far more dangerous: stories. They told tales of their own history, of previous wars, of times when they had faced seemingly impossible odds and emerged victorious. These stories spread through human communication networks faster than Coalition jamming systems could block them. They had done this before, Kree realized aloud. Not against us, but against each other. They had spent millennia perfecting the art of war, not against alien invaders, but against themselves. Every tactic we employed, every strategy we implemented, they had already faced variations of it in their own conflicts. The Coalition's advanced sensor networks, capable of detecting life signs through solid matter, became useless as humans learned to mask their presence using techniques that bordered on the supernatural. They would disappear into ruins that sensors showed as empty, only to emerge hours later in locations that should have been impossible to reach. They understood their own planet in ways we couldn't comprehend, Kree explained. Every tunnel, every building, every piece of terrain was a potential weapon. They had turned their entire world into a fortress without us realizing it. The most disturbing revelation came when Coalition engineers began examining captured human technology. What they had dismissed as primitive was actually elegantly efficient. Human weapons were designed to be easily manufactured, easily repaired, and easily modified. While Coalition equipment required specialized facilities and rare materials, humans could produce effective weapons using scavenged materials and basic tools. They were building new weapons faster than we could destroy them, Kree said. Every day, every hour, they were creating something new. Not just copies of our technology, but improvements, adaptations, weapons specifically designed to counter our advantages. The Coalition's energy shields, impenetrable to energy weapons, proved vulnerable to human kinetic projectiles. Their advanced armor, designed to disperse heat and energy, could be penetrated by simple sharpened metal driven by human determination. Their sophisticated communication systems could be jammed by human music. But the worst part, Kree continued, was how they treated our prisoners. Not with cruelty that we could have understood. They treated us with kindness, with respect. They gave us medical care, food, shelter. They talked to us like we were people, not conquerors. This unexpected humanity had a devastating effect on Coalition morale. Soldiers who had been taught to view humans as inferior primitives found themselves being treated with dignity by their captors. Some began to question the purpose of the invasion, the morality of their actions, the very foundations of Coalition society. They were changing us, Kree admitted. Not through force or propaganda, but through example. They showed us what we could be, what we should be. And many of us began to wonder if we had been wrong about everything. The Coalition's technological advantage, their greatest strength, became their greatest weakness as humans learned to turn it against them. They couldn't simply retreat and return with better weapons. Humans were learning too quickly, adapting too rapidly. By the 5th day, Kree said, we weren't fighting humans anymore. We were fighting ourselves. The steady rhythm of the medical bay's life support systems seemed to echo the pulse of Kree's memories as he delved deeper into the most disturbing aspects of humanity's defense of their world. Dr. Vex observed subtle changes in his physiological responses. Not stress, but something approaching awe. The humans possessed something that our xenobiologists had never documented in any species, Kree said, his voice carrying a mixture of fear and admiration. They had the ability to transform hopelessness into strength, despair into determination. It was as if suffering only made them more dangerous. Coalition Command had expected human resistance to follow predictable patterns. All previous species had shown measurable decreases in combat effectiveness as casualties mounted and infrastructure crumbled. Humans exhibited the opposite trend. Their fighting capacity actually increased as conditions worsened. I witnessed a human settlement that had been under continuous bombardment for 6 days, Cree continued. No food, no clean water, no medical supplies. Half the population was dead or wounded. By every metric we understood, they should have surrendered or collapsed into chaos. Instead, they organized a counterattack that destroyed an entire coalition. Regiment. The psychological profiles coalition intelligence had developed for humans proved catastrophically inadequate. They had underestimated humanity's capacity for what humans called gallows humor, the ability to find amusement in the darkest circumstances. Coalition intercepts revealed human soldiers joking about their impossible situation, making light of their own imminent deaths, somehow finding strength in their shared suffering. They laughed, Cree said, his scales shifting to a pale yellow. In the middle of battles, while their comrades died around them, while facing certain defeat, they laughed. Not hysteria, genuine amusement. They found something funny about the idea of a galactic coalition being unable to defeat a single planet. This inexplicable human response had a profound effect on coalition morale. Soldiers who had conquered worlds without losing sleep began experiencing what human psychologists called existential dread. The idea that their enemies could find humor in such desperate circumstances challenged every assumption about the nature of conflict and suffering. The coalition's most elite units, the Vanguard Corps, had been deployed to break human resistance through overwhelming force. These were soldiers who had never known defeat, who had pacified entire systems without losing a single battle. Within 48 hours of engagement with human forces, 60% of them had requested transfer to other assignments. The humans had a saying, Cree recalled. They would tell each other to embrace the chaos, not accept it, not endure it, but embrace it. They found strength in unpredictability, power in improvisation. Every time we thought we had them cornered, they would do something completely unexpected. The coalition's tactical computers, capable of calculating millions of variables and predicting enemy behavior with 99% accuracy, became useless against humans. Human decision-making seemed to operate on principles that defied logical analysis. They would make choices that appeared suicidal, but somehow achieved strategic objectives. I watched a human commander order his forces to retreat directly into a trap, Cree said. Our sensors showed coalition forces surrounding them on all sides. It should have been a massacre. Instead, they used the trap as a staging ground for an ambush that decimated our forces. They had predicted our prediction of their behavior. The most disturbing aspect of human psychology was their apparent ability to compartmentalize suffering. Coalition interrogators, skilled in breaking the will of captured enemies, found themselves unable to extract meaningful intelligence from human prisoners. Not because humans were resistant to pain, but because they seemed to process it differently. They would discuss the most horrific experiences as if they were talking about the weather, Cree explained. A human soldier who had lost his entire unit, who had been tortured for information, who faced execution, would ask his guards about their families, about their home worlds, about what they hoped to do after the war ended. This inexplicable human compassion, even toward their enemies, created a psychological crisis within coalition ranks. Soldiers began questioning orders, refusing to participate in what they termed excessive violence, requesting transfers to non-combat positions. The humans' ability to maintain their humanity while engaged in the most brutal warfare began to highlight the coalition's own moral compromises. They were winning, Cree said simply. Not through superior technology or tactics, but through superior spirit. They were making us realize that we had become something we never intended to be. The medical bay had grown quiet, except for the soft hum of life support systems and the occasional beep of monitoring equipment. Cree's scales had settled into a deep blue, a color Dr. Vex recognized as indicating profound contemplation rather than distress. The retreat began on the 8th day, Cree said, his voice carrying the weight of a truth that had taken him months to process. Not because we were defeated militarily, but because we had lost something more fundamental. We had lost the certainty that we were right. Coalition Command had never issued a formal retreat order. Instead, individual ship captains began withdrawing their forces, citing tactical repositioning and supply concerns. The truth was more complicated and far more disturbing. The Coalition's most experienced officers had begun to question the entire premise of the invasion. The humans had shown us mirror images of ourselves, Cree continued. Every tactic we employed, they had used against each other in their own history. Every justification we offered for conquest, they had heard before from their own species. They knew exactly what we were because they had been us. The final straw had come when human representatives, broadcasting on Coalition frequencies, began reading from their own historical records. They recounted wars between human nations, describing tactics, motivations, and outcomes that paralleled the Coalition's own expansion across the galaxy. The message was clear. Humanity had already explored every path the Coalition thought it was pioneering. They had made all our mistakes, Cree said. They had conquered their own kind, justified it with the same reasoning we used, and learned from the consequences. They knew how our story would end because they had lived it already. The Coalition's strength had always been its unity, dozens of species working together toward common goals. But the humans had revealed this unity to be superficial, based on shared advantages rather than shared values. When those advantages proved insufficient, the unity cracked. Species began withdrawing from the Coalition, Cree explained. Not just from the invasion, but from the alliance itself. They had seen what humans were capable of, and they began to wonder what they might become if pushed to similar extremes. The humans' final message to the Coalition had been neither triumphant nor threatening. Instead, it had been an invitation, an offer to share their knowledge, their technology, their understanding of conflict and its resolution. They offered to teach the Coalition what they had learned through millennia of warfare, that true strength came not from the ability to destroy, but from the ability to choose not to. They offered us redemption, Cree said, his voice barely audible. After everything we had done, after all the suffering we had caused, they offered us a chance to be better than we were. The Coalition's response had been to withdraw completely from human space, implementing a quarantine that would prevent any contact between humans and the rest of the galaxy. Official reports classified the mission as a strategic victory that had achieved its objectives through diplomatic means. The truth was buried in classified files that would never see the light of day. But some of us remember, Cree said, looking directly at Dr. Vex. Some of us know what we encountered on that small blue world. We met a species that had mastered the art of war so completely that they had transcended it. They had learned to find strength and weakness, hope and despair, unity and diversity. The Coalition continued to expand across the galaxy, but its expansion took on a different character after the Earth incident. Invasions became negotiations. Conquest became alliance. The human example had changed something fundamental in how the Coalition viewed its own purpose. They taught us that being human isn't about biology, Cree concluded. It's about choice. The choice to be better than your circumstances, better than your history, better than your enemies expect you to be. They taught us that true victory isn't about defeating your opponent. It's about making victory unnecessary. Dr. Vex made final notes in her records, but she knew that Cree's testimony would never be officially documented. The Coalition's leadership had decreed that the Earth incident would remain classified indefinitely. Too many careers, too many institutions, too many fundamental beliefs depended on maintaining the fiction that the mission had been a success. "Will you submit this testimony?" Dr. Vex asked. Cree's scales shifted to a brilliant gold, the color of determination among his people. "Yes," he said. "Because somewhere in the galaxy, there might be another species like the humans. And if the Coalition encounters them, they deserve to know what they're really facing." The medical bay fell silent as Dr. Vex completed her final entries. Outside the viewport, stars wheeled slowly through the void, each one potentially harboring worlds like Earth worlds where intelligence had evolved, not just the capacity for war, but the wisdom to transcend it. The humans had won more than a single battle. They had won the right to define what victory meant,